You're watching Jasmine Lovetale's original story. Frederick Sutton did not lower the belt when his daughter fell. Sienna was already on her knees, palms flat against the stone floor of Sutton Keep's lower hall, trying to steady her breathing. She did not cry out. She had learned that crying only made him angrier. The torchlight along the walls flickered over her bare shoulders, showing the thin white lines from punishments past. She kept her eyes on the ground, because looking at him was worse. "You were born to strengthen this house," Frederick said, his voice hard and controlled. "Instead, you shame it." Sienna tasted blood where her teeth cut into her lip. Her thoughts were simple and sharp. If I speak, he will strike again. If I stay silent, he might stop. The belt came down across her back. Upstairs, nobles gathered for the arrival of the Alpha King, Connor Beckwith of the Northern Crown. The guards at the gate straightened. Hooves thundered across the courtyard. Frederick raised his arm again. Then the main doors opened, and the king walked in. "Hey, quick question before we continue. How are you feeling right now? If this opening already has your heart racing, thank you for being here. Truly, it means more than you know. I'm working toward 1,000 subscribers, and if stories like this move you, please take 1 second to subscribe to Jasmine Lovetales, smash the like button, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. All right. Now let's see what happens when a broken daughter meets a king who refuses to look away. The lower hall of Sutton Keep had no windows. It sat 2 levels beneath the great hall, carved directly into the hill the stronghold rested on. The walls were black stone, perpetually damp from the underground spring that ran beneath the foundation, and whatever torchlight reached them caught the wet sheen of the rock and made it look like skin. 2 torch brackets of rusted iron gave the only light, and their flames bent and steadied with every draught that pushed through the narrow passage from the eastern stairwell. The smell down here was stone dust, old wood, and underneath all of it, the faint, persistent bite of silver that had worked itself into the mortar over years of exposure. Sienna Sutton had spent more hours in this hall than she had spent in any room in the keep above. She was 20 years old, and she was lean, the way people who do not eat enough become lean. Not the lean of training, but the lean of subtraction. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, because no one had given her a proper pin since her 16th year, and it had grown long enough now to reach the middle of her back. Her dress was grey wool, mended twice at the right sleeve, and once along the hem, patched at both elbows with a slightly different weight of fabric, because the patching had been done with whatever was at hand. The dress was clean. Sienna kept herself clean with a determination that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with the one thing she could still control. But it was too thin for the cold that crawled up from the stone floor and into her knees where she knelt. She kept her hands flat. Palms down, fingers spread, their weight distributed. She had learned over 4 years that the position of her hands mattered. Fists meant defiance, reaching meant pleading, and both invited extension. Flat hands, pressed down, weight forward, eyes on the stone. That was the geometry of minimum duration. Frederick Sutton stood over her. He was 6 feet and 2 inches of a man who had once been genuinely formidable, the kind of alpha who drew other wolves into formation without raising his voice, whose pack had numbered 400 strong at the height of his influence, whose name had carried enough weight in the political halls of the Silvermore Dominion that 3 neighboring packs had sought his blessing before announcing their own alliances. That was 12 years ago. What the failures since then had taken the formidability and compressed it into something smaller and meaner, the way pressure compresses coal, except the result was not a diamond. His hair had gone grey at the temples. His face held the lines of a man who had run out of explanations that satisfied him, and who had solved that problem by finding a single explanation that absorbed everything. Sienna. He rolled the belt around his fist. The leather was old, dark with use, the buckle silver-tipped. The silver was a practical choice, and also, Sienna had come to understand, a deliberate one. On skin with her particular sensitivity to the compound already in her blood, the buckle's contact left marks that lasted longer than ordinary leather. 4 noble houses are in this keep tonight, Frederick said. His voice did not rise. It never rose. That was one of the things about him that the rest of the Dominion did not understand. They expected a violent man to be loud, but Frederick was quiet, and the quiet made the violence feel more considered, more personal. The Howick delegation came from 3 territories away. Lord Prescott brought his eldest son and his full household staff, which means he is interested in a serious arrangement. Every alliance I have left is sitting at my table, and you are down here breathing. Sienna said nothing. Her jaw was set. The inside of her cheek was already sore from where she had bitten down on it during the first strike, and she was focused on keeping that jaw set, on not letting it tremble. If I speak, he will say I am arguing. If I cry, he will call me weak and extend this. If I look at him, he will say I am defiant. Oh, there is no correct answer. There has never been a correct answer. Madeline shifted at 15, Frederick continued. He began to pace, his footsteps unhurried, the belt still wrapped around his fist. The sound of his boots on stone was steady and deliberate. Tegan shifted at 16, 3 days after her ceremony, clean and strong. I watched both of them come into their wolves, and I thought, this house stands. 7 generations of alphas and lunas. The blood holds. He stopped pacing. He was behind her now. And then there was you. The belt came down across the back of her shoulders. Sienna's breath expelled in a sharp, controlled burst through her nose. Her hands pressed harder into the floor. The pain was horizontal and immediate, a line of fire that would fade to deep bruising by morning, and she had learned to distinguish between the two quickly, to assess damage while it was happening, so she knew where she stood when it was over. Her wolf moved. It was the same sensation she had lived with since she was 16, a pushing from inside, as though something pressed a hand against the inside of her ribs and leaned its weight. It rose, and immediately the silver in her blood smothered it, pressed it back, and the sensation collapsed like a wave that had built only to spend itself against rock. She had described this feeling to herself in 100 different ways over 4 years. A trapped thing, a buried voice, a fire that someone kept putting out. She had long since stopped describing it to anyone else because the last time she had tried, 2 years ago, to a visiting healer her father had allowed into the keep for reasons that had nothing to do with Sienna's welfare. The healer had told Frederick, and the next correction had been the worst one. You stood in the sacred circle in front of every pack elder in the Silvermore Dominion, Frederick said, walking back around to face her now, looking down. You stood there while the full moon was overhead, and the whole pack was watching, and you gave them nothing. You gave me nothing. He crouched, which was worse than standing, because crouching meant he was going to speak quietly, and quiet meant prolonged. Do you know what I had to tell the council? That my daughter was delayed, a late shifter, that the bloodline was intact, and she would come into her wolf by the next ceremony. He studied her face. That was 4 years ago. Do you know what they call a wolf who still hasn't shifted by 20? She knew. She had heard the word applied to herself by enough people that it had long since ceased to have the power to wound. It was simply one of the words that meant Sienna. Defective. "Your sisters have prospects," Frederick said, straightening. "They have worth in the political market of this dominion. Men ask about them. Packs negotiate around their bloodlines. And then someone inevitably asks about the third daughter." His voice went flat. "I am done explaining to you. Tonight you will not exist. You will stay in this hall. You will not go above the first sub-level stairs. And if I find that you have been seen by a single guest, I will not be having this conversation with you tomorrow. But I will be having something considerably less gentle." He turned and walked toward the eastern stairwell. Sienna waited until his footsteps faded completely. She counted them. She always counted, not the marks on her back, not yet, but the footsteps first, until she was certain he was gone. 32 steps to the stair, 12 steps up the stairs to the service landing, then the door, which she heard close. She sat back on her heels. She reached behind herself carefully and pressed 2 fingers to her lower back, feeling through the wool for the location of the welts. She found 3 distinct lines. Then she moved to her shoulders, 3 more from earlier in the week, now faded to the deep yellow of old bruising. And the newest one, the one from this evening, crossing the first set at an angle. And she counted them the way she always counted, not to grieve them. She had run out of grief for them some time ago. She counted because the counting was something precise and verifiable, an act of witness in the absence of any other witness. These things happened. Here is the evidence. 7 marks. Above her, through 2 floors of stone and timber, she could hear the distant movement of the household preparing for the arrival. Chair legs on the great hall floor, the kitchen staff moving at pace, boots on the main staircase, and then, from the outer courtyard, clearly even through the foundation, 3 long trumpet calls, evenly spaced, clean, the signal for visiting royalty. Sienna lifted her head. She knew what the signal meant. The whole keep had been talking about nothing else for a week. The Alpha King of the Northern Crown had sent his advance notice 12 days ago, a formal document on white parchment with the Northern Star seal requesting accommodation and meeting space for a delegation of 20, purpose listed as border treaty review and territorial audit. Frederick had spent 11 of those 12 days in a state of controlled agitation that he expressed through additional corrections to Sienna and through increasingly elaborate instructions to the household staff. She had never seen the Alpha King. Almost no one in the Silvermore Dominion had, except those who had travelled north for the annual Council of Packs, which Frederick had stopped attending 3 years ago. She sat on the cold stone floor and listened to the sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard above. And she allowed herself exactly 15 seconds of wandering before she stopped. Kings didn't come to storage rooms. She had already been told where she was to remain. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and settled in to wait. Chapter 2. The outer courtyard of Sutton Keep was large enough to hold 200 soldiers at formation, bordered on the south by the stables and on the north and west by the high curtain wall, lit tonight by a double row of standing torch poles along the path from the main gate to the keep's front entrance. The household guard had been positioned in full dress, their silver-crested helmets polished, their bearing straight, and every stable hand and kitchen runner had been cleared from the courtyard, so that only those with visible purpose remained. De Frederick Sutton stood at the top of the keep's front steps with the composed, welcoming expression of a man who had been practicing it for 11 days. Madeline Sutton stood at his right hand. She was 23, the eldest daughter, dark-haired and precise in her movements, wearing a gown of deep winter blue that had been chosen. Sienna had once overheard her explaining to Tegan, because blue connoted stability and reliability in northern pack culture. Madeline had researched this. She had been researching Connor Beckwith of the Northern Crown for a year, because Madeline Sutton considered information the only currency that did not depreciate, and the Alpha King was the most consequential unmarried male in the 7 territories. Tegan stood at Frederick's left hand. She was 18, sharp-featured where Madeline was composed, but with a restless quality to her stillness, the posture of someone whose mind moved faster than the conversation around her, and who had learned to conceal the impatience this produced. She was wearing gold silk that their father had ordered 6 weeks ago, and that had cost the household's entertainment budget for the quarter. She kept her fingers still with visible effort. Neither of them had asked about Sienna since morning. The gates opened. The Alpha King's company rode in on black horses bred for mountain terrain, heavy in the shoulder, sure-footed, with the calmer temperament of animals that had been properly trained rather than simply dominated. 20 riders in the dark grey livery of the Northern Crown. They moved in a column and stopped in good order, and the discipline of it was notable. No horse sidled, but no rider looked around with the open curiosity of a man seeing something new. They had done this many times. At the centre of the column, on a horse that stood half a hand taller than the rest, rode Connor Beckwith. He was younger than expected. The Alpha King of the Northern Crown was 26 years old, and he had held that crown since he was 17, and 9 years of carrying that particular weight had given him something that was difficult to isolate and easy to recognize, a quality of completeness, of a thing that has been shaped to its final form and does not need to be explained. He was tall and broad through the chest, dark-haired, with the build of a man who fought regularly and not for demonstration. He dismounted without ceremony, handing the reins to a groom with a brief word of thanks that Sienna, and had she been able to hear it, would have noted as the first sign that this man was not his predecessor. He stood in the courtyard for a moment, his chin lifted. It was a small movement, barely visible in the torchlight, the fractional tilt of a man who has caught something in the air and is identifying it. His nostrils moved once. Arthur Richmond drew up beside him. Arthur was 41 years old, grey at the temples, with the quiet, attentive economy of a man who had served as royal advisor long enough that most of his reactions had become internal. He was the only person in the Northern Crown's household who could read Connor's silences with reliable accuracy, and he read this one immediately. The king had caught a scent. Arthur remained still and said nothing. Connor's gaze moved across the courtyard. His eyes tracked methodically. The guards in formation, their faces showing the particular blank attention of men told to look welcoming, the servants arranged at the keep's doorway, the torch brackets, the stonework of the keep's face, and then downward, past the main door, past the foundation planting, to the narrow ventilation slits cut into the base of the curtain wall at ground level to allow airflow to the lower levels. Something was being suppressed down there. Not weapon silver. He could identify weapon silver in under 2 breaths, and it smelled clean and cold. This was a medicinal compound, organic silver of the kind that worked on wolf blood from the inside. And underneath it, layered beneath the silver like a voice speaking from behind a closed door, was the faintest suggestion of something else, but a wolf that had not been allowed to surface. He filed it. He did not let it change his expression. He continued up the steps. Frederick descended 2 steps to receive him, the correct protocol, a host stepping down to meet a king without requiring the king to climb to reach him. Frederick's smile was warm and wide and completely professional. Your Majesty, Sutton Keep is honoured by your presence. Connor shook his hand once. The grip was brief and exact. Alpha Sutton, I appreciate the hospitality. Your advance rider gave us good information about the northern road. The river crossing was passable as promised. I am glad to hear it. My steward has prepared the eastern wing for your company. Frederick gestured toward the doors. We have a meal waiting whenever you are ready. I would appreciate an hour before the evening meal, but my advisor and I have correspondence to review, and we have been riding since before the second morning bell. Connor's gaze moved briefly to Madeline, then to Tegan, not appraising in the way Frederick had arranged for, but noting the way a man takes note of who is present in a room before he decides what to say. Then back to Frederick. We will also need time tomorrow morning to sit with your border records. The tribute agreements from 5 years past have language in the 3rd and 7th clauses that requires discussion. Frederick's smile stayed in place, but the skin around his eyes tightened by a fraction. Of course, whatever the Crown requires. Connor nodded and walked through the keep's main doors. Arthur fell into step half a pace behind, carrying the leather dispatch satchel that never left his person on the road. Or as they crossed the threshold into the entrance hall, he leaned slightly toward Connor and dropped his voice below the level of the guards following them. You found something in the courtyard. Silver compound in the foundation stones, Connor said, equally quiet. Not fresh. This is years of accumulation. The compound was administered regularly enough and long enough that it has worked into the mortar. Medicinal grade. Organic silver suspension. Arthur walked for 3 steps, processing. A pack member being dosed. Continuously. Whoever it is has been receiving doses long enough that the residue has saturated the lower stonework, which means they are kept below. He did not look at Arthur as he spoke, his attention on the corridor they were entering, his pace unhurried. And the wolf I can sense is not dead. It has never shifted. It is restrained. Arthur said, one of the daughters is not present in the courtyard. He introduced 2 daughters. They walked on. In his chest, Connor's wolf leaned forward in the way it hadn't leaned in 3 years of searching. Specific, targeted, certain. The bond thread that had been an abstract ache since the prophet Imogen Fisk had told him what to look for was suddenly taut and directional, the way a compass needle stops being a compass and starts being a certainty. He kept his face still and his stride even, and thought, I need to wait until the house is quiet. Chapter 3. Connor dismissed his personal guard at the guest wing door at the 11th hour, instructed Arthur to handle the evening's correspondence, and waited in silence until the keep settled into its late-night rhythms, the kitchen staff finishing their clearing, the guard rotation completing its change at the main hall, the household's muted conversations dying away above him as candles were extinguished floor by floor. He moved through the servants' corridor behind the eastern wing before the 12th bell. He carried no torch. His lichen night vision required none, and a torch in the lower passages at this hour would be noted. He moved without sound, not the careful movement of a man trying to be quiet, but the natural, practiced silence of someone whose wolf moved through the body like water through stone, finding the paths of least resistance. He knew the layout of Sutton Keep from the survey maps his steward had obtained 3 weeks before the delegation set out. The lower levels had been drawn in detail, including the storage rooms along the sub-foundation passage. He passed the kitchen entrance, smelled the residue of the evening's meal still warm in the stones, the wine cellar, the main supply corridor. He reached the last door in the sub-foundation passage, heavy oak, iron-banded, with a bolt on the outside, and stopped. The silver scent was concentrated here. And beneath it, the wolf he had been tracking since the courtyard, now close enough that his own wolf was pressing forward in his chest with controlled urgency. He drew the bolt. He pushed the door inward slowly. The storage chamber held old crates along the far wall, a broken spinning wheel with a missing spindle, a stack of folded sacking that had been there long enough to develop a smell. Near the right wall, a pallet. 'Twere on the pallet a blanket so thin that calling it a blanket was an act of generosity. Sienna Sutton sat on that pallet with her back against the stone and her knees drawn to her chest. She was awake. She had been awake for hours by the quality of her alertness, not the heightened watchfulness of someone startled from sleep, but the deep, habitual alertness of someone who slept lightly in this place, because sleeping deeply was a risk she did not take. She looked at him with the specific controlled expression of a person who has encountered unexpected things in this room before, and who has developed a protocol for how to behave when they do. The protocol appeared to be, do not move, do not speak, do not allow the face to show anything that can be used as information. Connor stood in the doorway and did not advance. He let the light from the passage fall into the room and kept his silhouette as unintimidating as a man his size was capable of, which was not very, but the attempt mattered. He registered what he could see, the bruising on her wrists showing below the sleeve of her dress, layered, not fresh, the pattern of repeated injury to the same location, the split lip, still healing from something recent, the way she held her shoulders forward and inward, a posture assembled over years from the practical understanding that making yourself smaller made you a smaller target. The thinness of her frame, visible even in the shapeless dress. And her wolf, he could feel it now at close range, more clearly than he had felt it through 2 floors of stone. It was alive. It was awake. It was pushing against something, and the something was the silver in her blood. And even through that suppression, the wolf's orientation toward him was unmistakable. His jaw tightened. He kept his face still. "You can step forward," he said. He kept his voice low and even, the same register he used when an animal had been mistreated and needed to hear a voice without threat in it. "I am not going to hurt you." Sienna did not move immediately. She studied him with an expression that was doing very precise work, assessing distance, assessing his position relative to the door, assessing the quality of his stillness. He recognized the calculation because he had seen versions of it in the other cases. The automatic threat assessment of a person who had learned that trust was a vulnerability and had adjusted accordingly. "Oh, kings do not come to storage rooms," she thought. Her father must have sent him. This is some new test, a new way of finding out if I will say something I shouldn't say. She stood slowly, keeping the wall at her back, and said nothing. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sienna Sutton." He had known it would be. The certainty settled through him with the specific, quiet authority of a thing that has been true for a long time and has simply been waiting to be confirmed. He let a moment pass. "How long have you been kept in this room?" She hesitated. He saw the calculation, how much to give, what the risk was, whether honesty was a trap. "Since I was 16, she said finally. "That is 4 years. He took a single step into the room, slowly. Her shoulder blades moved toward the wall. He stopped. "Sienna, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly. I am not testing you. I am not here because your father sent me." He met her eyes and kept them. "Who brings your meals?" "The kitchen girl. Paige Swales." Her voice was careful. "She brings a tray in the morning and one at night." "Does she bring a drink with the food? A tonic? Something besides water?" Sienna's hands, which had been loose at her sides, curled slightly at the knuckles. He saw the small movement. "Yes, a tonic. My father says it supports the blood when there is no working wolf. For my weakness." Connor looked at her for a long moment. "It is not supporting anything," he said. He chose his words deliberately, clearly, but without any inflection that invited argument, because this was not an argument. It was a fact being delivered to a person who deserved to have it. It is a silver compound, organic suspension of silver in a water-soluble base. Administered in the doses your symptoms suggest, it does not kill a wolf. It interrupts the wolf's ability to communicate with the human mind. It prevents shifting and weakens instinct over time. Sienna's jaw moved, once side to side, a small, involuntary motion that she stopped immediately. "Someone has been giving this to you deliberately for 4 years, Connor said. "It is illegal under the Northern Accord. It is classified as willful harm to a pack member, and it is the reason your wolf has never been able to reach you." She pressed her back against the wall. Not in retreat, but in the way a person braces a structure that has suddenly shifted, needing something solid behind them, while they take in a weight of information that is too large to carry standing freely. "My wolf is not gone," she said. The words came out slowly, as though she was trying the weight of each one. "No," he said. "She is not gone. She is being held down." Sienna looked at the far wall. Her breathing had changed. Slower now, more deliberate, the breathing of a person who has learned to keep their interior processes invisible. But her hands were shaking. She noticed it herself and pressed them against her thighs. "Can it be reversed?" "Yes." He took another step forward, the same unhurried pace as the first. She did not move away this time. "It will take time. Your wolf has been suppressed for years, and she will need to rebuild her connection to her own body. But she is there. I can sense her." He held her eyes. "She is stronger than you have been permitted to know." Chapter 4. He found her at the forest edge, an hour before midnight. She had gone there without asking, the only act of pure, unguided impulse she could remember committing since she was a child, slipping through the side gate of the keep's curtain wall that the groundskeeper left unlatched from inside on warm evenings. The forest behind Sutton Keep was old growth, pine and oak together, the kind of mixed forest that took 2 centuries to settle into its full density, with a floor of compressed needles and old leaves that was springy and silent under bare feet. She had come here on nights when the lower hall became unbearable. The rogues avoided her because of the silver in her blood, and the pack's wolves avoided her because of what she was said to be, and so the forest had been hers alone for years. She sat at the edge of the tree line and looked at the moon, and tried to understand what she felt. The pressure in her chest was stronger tonight than it had been in 2 years. Since the Alpha King had entered the keep, since he had stood in the storage room and spoken to her in that level, careful voice, her wolf had been pushing with increasing force against whatever held it down. It did not feel like panic. It felt like recognition. "You should not be out alone at this hour." She turned. Connor stood at the edge of the trees behind her, still in his formal dinner wear, having removed his outer coat and draped it over one arm. He moved toward her with the same careful, unhurried approach as earlier, giving her time to register him, to decide, to not feel cornered. "I did not plan to stay long," she said. "I needed air." "I am not telling you to go back." He sat on a fallen log at a comfortable distance from her, the way a man sits when he intends to stay a while and does not want his staying to feel like pressure. "I followed the scent." She pulled her shawl tighter. "What does a silver compound do to someone over 4 years? Truly, all of it." He looked at her steadily. She appreciated that he did not soften the question by softening his answer. "Your body chemistry adjusts to the presence of the compound," he said. Your wolf's signaling pathways become suppressed to the point where you cannot feel them ordinarily. And the first months are the worst. There would have been episodes of physical pain, unexplained fever, hypersensitivity to light on full moon nights. Then the body compensates. The dosing becomes the baseline, and you stop noticing most of the suppression except as absence. He paused. The absence of things you were told you never had to begin with. Sienna looked down at her hands. They were unremarkable hands, calloused from work, the nails kept short, the knuckles slightly prominent in the cold. Her mother's hands, she had been told once, before her mother disappeared when she was 9. She had almost no memory of her mother. One of the things Frederick had told her over the years was that her mother had gone because she could not bear the shame of a daughter who would not shift, or Sienna had believed this for a long time with the thorough, uncritical belief of a child who had no other story available. "Why would my father do this?" she asked. Not because she did not already know. She knew. She simply needed to hear it stated outside the architecture of justifications he had built around it over 4 years. "Control," Connor said. "A daughter who shifts is a daughter with power. Power in a wolf pack is not abstract. It is physical, political, reproductive. A strong she-wolf from a 7-generation alpha bloodline is a commodity in the political market of these territories. She can negotiate her own alliances. She can attract mates of comparable rank. She can, if the conditions are right, challenge for leadership." He kept his voice even. "A daughter declared defective and mentally unstable can be used for labor, or blamed for any convenient failure, and silenced without recourse." She pressed her palms flat on her knees. Her fingers were not shaking now. They had gone very still with the specific stillness of someone who has stopped managing the weight of a truth and has simply put it down on the ground and is looking at it. "I suspected Silvermore for a year," Connor said. "I have been tracking illegal silver usage across the territories for 3 years. There were 3 prior cases, all suppressed female wolves, all from politically compromised families, all fathers, in each case, all making the same calculation your father made." He reached across and placed his hand over hers on her knee, palm down, warm. He did not grip. He simply rested it there. "May I?" She looked down at his hand on hers. Then she turned her hand over, palm up. He pressed his other palm flat against the center of her chest, just below the collarbone. The warmth came immediately, radiating heat from his lichen core, spreading through her ribs, dropping into her sternum. And with it, from somewhere she had almost stopped believing existed, the pressure she had lived with for 4 years rose up as though meeting something at a surface. Her wolf pushed, hard enough that Sienna made a sound in the back of her throat, a short, startled sound. Her hand closed around his fingers. "She heard you," he said quietly. His hand held steady against her chest. "She recognizes a lichen bond at close range. She is responding." Sienna sat very still, holding the sensation, but the pressure was overwhelming compared to what she usually felt. Full and urgent and ancient in a way that made her ordinary breathing feel like something that belonged to a different, smaller life. "What does that mean?" she managed. He looked at her for a long moment in the moonlight. His grey eyes in that light were entirely calm. "It means you are my mate," he said. Sienna stared at him. She had been told for 4 years, in various forms and by various voices, all of which ultimately derived from her father's one central voice, that she was nothing, that she was defective, that she was the error in a 7-generation sequence of strong wolves. She had been told this so thoroughly and for so long that it had become the water she swam in. Not believed exactly in the way you believe an argument, but inhabited. The way you inhabit a building you did not choose and cannot leave. That is impossible, she said. Your wolf is pressing against my bond right now, he said. That is not something a suppressed wolf does with a stranger. That is something a true mate does when she is near enough to feel the connection. I am no one. You are exactly who I have been looking for. She looked away from him, out at the dark trees. Her chest was aching with the pressure of her wolf pushing, still pushing, even through the silver. Somewhere behind her ribs, something that had been held down for 4 years was straining toward the surface with a force that frightened her. Not because it felt wrong, but because feeling it felt right was more than she had any prepared response for. I had a vision brought to me 3 years ago, Connor said, or his voice was quiet and factual. A prophet named Imogen Fisk from the Eastern Reaches. She came to my court with a specific message. She told me my true mate would carry silver in her blood that was not her own, that she would be hidden, that she would be in pain that had gone on long enough that she had stopped calling it pain and had started calling it simply her life. He looked at Sienna steadily. I spent 3 years following cases of illegal silver use through the territories. Everyone I found, I investigated. Everyone led somewhere, and none of them led to the right place until I caught your scent from the road 2 miles outside the keep. He paused. Jasmine and cold rain and something beneath both of those that I cannot name because I have never smelled it before. It is just you. Sienna pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. She did not cry. She had made a private agreement with herself years ago about crying, not that she refused to, but that she would only allow it when she was entirely alone, because she had learned that tears in front of people were a show of something, and she had nothing left to give as a show. When she moved her hand away, her face was composed. I do not know how to be anything other than what I am, she said. I do not know how to be someone's queen. I did not know how to be a king when I was 17, and they put the crown on my head, he said. I learned. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. There is no version of this that requires you to become someone else. I am not looking for a different woman, and I came for you. Chapter 5. Frederick Sutton discovered that the Alpha King had gone below stairs before the evening meal was fully cleared. He discovered it through Madeline, who had watched the guest wing corridor from the servants' access point, with a patience born of 3 years of understanding that the right information at the right moment was more valuable than any dress. She reported back to her father's study before the second bell of night, standing in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression carrying the careful neutrality of a woman delivering facts whose implications she had already calculated, and whose loyalties were still in the process of being finalized. Frederick sat at his desk with both hands flat on the polished wood and did not move for a full minute after she finished speaking. But the implications arranged themselves clearly. The Alpha King had gone to the lower levels. The Alpha King had, therefore, found Sienna. The Alpha King of the Northern Crown, the highest-ranking wolf in the 7 territories, whose testimony before the council could move mountains and whose legal authority under Alpha law was essentially absolute, had spoken privately with the one person in Sutton Keep who could, if she chose to, tell a version of events that Frederick could not counter. He was not a stupid man. He had made stupid choices. Choices born of the particular stupidity of a proud man who could not absorb failure, and who had therefore found ways to offload its cost onto those least able to resist. But he was not stupid, and the situation in front of him was clear. He crossed the study to the locked cabinet. He used the key on his belt, the one that never left his person, that he checked for at least 4 times a day, the way a man checks for a wound that has not healed. Inside the cabinet, 12 years of documents he had never allowed a secretary to handle. Financial records, pack council correspondences, political arrangements that existed in writing, because both parties needed the writing and would both be destroyed by its exposure. And the blood pact. The parchment was rolled and sealed with dark red wax, the seal of the Rogue Enforcer Company, the private mercenary operation run by Oscar Hackney out of the border reaches. Frederick had signed it 3 years ago, in the lowest point of 4 consecutive bad years. 2 failed harvests, the reparations debt from the eastern border conflict coming due, a treasury that held 2 months of operational expenses and nothing beyond that, and every legitimate lender in the 7 territories already extended to the family's limits. Oscar Hackney had offered terms that seemed, in the moment of desperation, reasonable. A structured loan, resource payments in pack commodities, a blood pact to bind the agreement, standard practice in mercenary financing, or so Hackney had told him, and Frederick had wanted badly enough to believe it that he had not looked at the secondary clause until the ink was dry. The secondary clause bound the entire Silvermore pack as collective guarantee. If Frederick defaulted, or if the arrangement was exposed to the Crown, Hackney's company had legal authority under blood pact law to mark every member of the pack for retaliatory enforcement. Not just Frederick, or every wolf in the Dominion. Frederick had used the clause once already, in his mind, when another challenge arose. He had never activated it. He had told himself he never would. He was telling himself something different tonight. He went to find Tegan, who had inherited the political calculation she had been born into and had spent 18 years sharpening it. She listened to his plan with her elbows on her knees and her chin in her hand, and she said nothing for a long moment. "You are going to discipline her publicly," she said, "before he can speak with her again, in front of all the guests. I am going to demonstrate, in front of 4 noble house witnesses and the Alpha King himself, that Sienna Sutton is unstable, violent, and incapable of credible testimony. Under the house discipline provisions, and I have the right to correct a dependent pack member's behavior publicly. If she has been speaking to guests without permission, and she has, that is a breach of the house conduct codes. And if Connor objects, he has no legal standing to interfere with house discipline unless—" Frederick stopped. "Unless she is his mate?" Tegan watched her father's face go through several calculations in quick succession. She said nothing, because she had been watching her father make decisions for 18 years, and she had learned that the decisions he made when he most needed someone to tell him he was wrong were the ones he was most determined to make without consultation. "She has no working wolf," Frederick said. "No bond can form without a wolf. His objection will have no standing." Tegan looked at the window, but the moon outside was high and cold. She pressed her lips together and said, quietly, "Yes, father." Chapter 6. The central courtyard of Sutton Keep was the largest open space in the Dominion's capital stronghold. On ordinary mornings it smelled of horses and hay and the forge smoke that drifted from the armory on the south side. This morning it was cold and still, and carried the particular smell of stone that had been scrubbed, which the household had been ordered to do before the 4th bell, so that the courtyard would look kept when the assembly was called. Frederick had framed the assembly as a matter of household order. The head steward had gone to each guest's room before first light with a politely worded request for their attendance at a brief formal address. Most of the noble house representatives had come out of curiosity, pulling cloaks over their formal wear, some of them still carrying cups of morning tea. Connor Beckwith had been at the assembly courtyard before the first household member arrived. Arthur had come to the guest wing before the servants had finished the morning circuit, sat in the chair by the window and said, "He has called an assembly," in the tone of a man who had been expecting something like this since the previous evening. Connor had already been dressed. They walked out together, and Connor positioned himself near the great hall's arched entrance, where he could see the entire courtyard and the 3 doors that opened onto it. Sienna was brought from the lower corridor by 2 household guards. She walked between them on her own feet. That was the first thing Connor registered, that she was walking under her own power, or not because she was unafraid, but because she had somewhere between 16 and 20 years of experience with the approach of bad things, and had assembled a posture for it that was not the posture of a person who expected to be saved. It was the posture of a person who had accepted the incoming harm and was making internal arrangements for surviving it. She was barefoot on the cold cobblestones. Her hair was loose. She wore the grey dress from the previous night, and she held herself with the particular stillness of a person who had learned that stillness was sometimes the only armor available. Frederick moved to the center of the courtyard with the bearing of a man exercising a legal right, which technically he was. Or the house discipline provision in the Silvermore Pack Code allowed an alpha to conduct formal corrections of dependent members in front of the household as a mechanism of public accountability. It was a provision designed for serious breaches of pack law. Frederick had been using it on Sienna since she was 16. "This household gathers to witness a matter of internal discipline," Frederick said. His voice carried cleanly in the cold morning air. "My youngest daughter has, over the course of the past year, repeatedly left her assigned rooms without authorization, made unauthorized contact with pack guests, and has been spreading false accounts of her circumstances to those with no knowledge of her condition." He let a breath pass. "She will kneel before this household and accept the correction of her alpha." The guards directed Sienna to the center of the courtyard. She went. She went because she had been going to the center of yards and halls and clearings since she was 16 years old, and her body knew the route. Her wolf, stronger now than it had been in years, and oriented toward the tall figure standing near the great hall with the grey eyes and the controlled jaw, was pushing so hard that her breath came in shallow bursts. But she went, and she knelt on the cold cobblestones, and she set her hands flat on the ground. Frederick produced the belt. It came from under his outer cloak, which meant he had brought it specifically for this. He rolled it once around his fist and stood behind her. Connor stepped away from the wall. He walked across the courtyard at a pace that was not hurried in any visible way, but covered the distance with an inevitability that was physical and absolute, like weather moving across a valley. You could watch it approaching, and you could not doubt that it would arrive. The guests around the courtyard's edge shifted and created space without being asked. The household guards in the outer ring took an involuntary step back. Frederick's arm was mid-lift. Connor stopped 6 feet away and looked at him. "Strike her once more," he said quietly, "and you answer to the crown." The words landed in the courtyard, and the courtyard went completely silent. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of 30 people simultaneously deciding to become very still. Frederick lowered his arm by 1 degree, but his face underwent a rapid and visible process of recalibration. He had prepared for several forms of objection. He had prepared legal responses, counter-arguments, invocations of house authority. He had not prepared for the quality of stillness that Connor Beckwith carried when he said those 5 words, which was not the stillness of a man about to argue, and was not the stillness of a man about to threaten, and was simply the stillness of a man who had already decided. "This is internal pack discipline," Frederick said. "You have no standing to intervene in house corrections." "She is my mate," Connor said. "Wait. Did you feel that shift? If that moment hit you the way it was supposed to, go ahead and tap that like button right now. That's the exact point where power changes hands. And if you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to Jasmine Love Tales so you never miss the next chapter. All right. Let's see what happens when a king stands between a father and his cruelty. The silence after those 3 words was a different quality than the silence that preceded them. Thicker, more loaded. The specific silence of a space in which everyone present is doing a rapid calculation about what this changes, and finding that the answer is everything. Madeline, standing near the great hall entrance, went very still. The particular stillness of a woman recalibrating a year's worth of strategic research. Tegan looked between her father and the Alpha King with the expression she'd had as a child, watching a structure she had assumed was permanent begin to crack. Not grief, exactly, but the specific reconfiguration of a world view. Frederick's voice went hard. "She has no working wolf. A mate bond requires 2 functioning wolves. Whatever you believe you sensed, her wolf has been suppressed by organic silver compounds administered without her knowledge since she was 16 years old," Connor said. He had not raised his voice once. He had not needed to. "I identified the compound in her blood at first contact. I have documented 3 precedent cases in neighboring territories with identical administration patterns, and I have a direct, active response from her wolf to my lichen bond, which is a biological event that cannot be fabricated and cannot occur in the absence of a living wolf." He held Frederick's gaze with the steadiness of a man who has been holding more than he has shown for longer than the person opposite him realizes. "Your daughter's wolf is alive. You knew it was alive, and you spent 4 years holding it under." Frederick's hand opened. The belt fell. He had not meant to drop it. His hand had made the decision independent of him, the way bodies sometimes do when the situation exceeds the mind's ability to maintain its performance. And then Connor shifted. Not full. Not the 9-foot lichen form of the Northern King at the height of his power. Half. The halfway point, which was in many ways more frightening than complete transformation, because complete transformation was animal, and animal was comprehensible. Half-shift was a man who had chosen not to become the animal, and that choice was visible and deliberate, and made the contained power of the thing that chose it feel all the more absolute. He grew, half a head of height. The bones of his jaw altered subtly, or his eyes illuminated from within, not reflecting light, generating it, silver-white and unwavering, the eyes of the Lichen King in authority. His hands changed, the fingers lengthening fractionally, and the cobblestones beneath his feet cracked in a clean line, extending 3 feet in each direction from where he stood. Every wolf in the courtyard went to one knee. It was involuntary. The rank pressure of a Lichen King in half-shift was biological, older than politics, older than law, older than every border agreement ever written between these packs. Bodies answered before minds could form a dissenting opinion, and 30 bodies, guards and noble house members and servants, and Tegan and Madeline included, went down together. Frederick did not drop. He was an alpha. His rank gave him enough resistance that he stayed upright, but his chest heaved once with the effort of it, and 1 foot moved back on the cobblestones, and the belt lay on the ground between them. Connor let 3 seconds pass. Then he allowed the half-shift to recede, not releasing the dominance, just withdrawing the physical expression of it. He returned to his full human form. His voice, when he spoke, was calm again. "By alpha law, I am calling a formal tribunal. every noble house present in this keep will witness. The charges are silver poisoning, sustained abuse of a dependent pack member, fraudulent declaration of mental defect, and any further violations the investigation uncovers. He looked across the silent, still courtyard. No one leave Sutton Keep until the tribunal concludes. He turned and walked to where Sienna knelt on the cobblestones. He crouched in front of her, not standing over her, crouching so that his eyes were level with hers. "Get up," he said. Not an order. A door opened. She raised her head. Her eyes were dry. They were very clear, and what was in them was not gratitude, and was not relief, and was not any of the softer things. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that the first moment someone else puts a hand on it feels less like relief than like discovery. The discovery that the weight was real, that someone else could feel it too. She stood. He put his arm around her shoulders, steady and solid, and walked her toward the great hall. Chapter 7. The tribunal convened in the great hall at the second hour past midday. The hall had been built for exactly this kind of use. The ceiling was 30 feet above the floor, vaulted with timber, hung with the Sutton family's banners, silver moon on dark blue, 7 stars in a line below the crescent, representing 7 generations of unbroken Alpha succession. The long trestle tables had been arranged by Arthur Richmond that morning into a horseshoe configuration, and he had done this with the practiced efficiency of a man who had arranged more formal proceedings than he cared to count, and who had very precise opinions about sightlines and seating order. Connor sat at the open head of the horseshoe. Arthur Richmond sat to his right with his leather satchel on the table and a set of documents arranged in front of him with the order and economy of a man who had been waiting to present this evidence for 3 years and had no intention of squandering the moment through disorganization. But the 4 noble House representatives sat along the left arm of the horseshoe. Lord Prescott from the Western Reach, a square-built man in his 50s who had arrived expecting a wedding negotiation, and who now held the expression of a man recalibrating his entire read of the Silvermoor Dominion's recent history. The Harwich delegation's senior member, a younger man named Spencer Clayton, who had the look of someone young enough to still be surprised by things, and experienced enough to know the surprise was important. 2 others whose attention was fixed, and whose silence was full. Frederick sat across the table from Connor, flanked by 2 of the Northern Crown's guards. His hands were folded on the table in the posture of a man maintaining form because he had nothing else left to maintain. He said nothing. He had been saying nothing since the courtyard, which Arthur had noted was a specific choice. A man who shouts at a tribunal is defending himself, and a man who defends himself provides a record of what he considered worth defending. Madeline and Tegan sat along the right arm of the horseshoe, separated from their father by 3 empty seats that Arthur had placed deliberately. Neither of them had looked at Frederick since they sat down. Madeline's expression was her professional face, open, composed, attending. Tegan was looking at the table in the manner of a young person who is doing a very large amount of thinking and does not want any of it to be visible. Sienna sat in a chair against the wall behind Connor's right shoulder. She had been placed there by Arthur, who had understood, without Connor saying it, or that she needed to be present, as witness, as the subject of the record, as a person whose presence made the proceedings honest, but that placing her at the table would expose her to a form of scrutiny she was not yet equipped to manage. From where she sat, she could see her father's face. She kept her hands in her lap and watched. Arthur Richmond opened his satchel. "I will present the evidence in 3 sections," he said. His voice was dry and clear and entirely without theatre, the voice of a man who trusted facts to do their own dramatic work and saw no reason to assist them. First, the matter of silver administration. Second, financial records and the blood pact. Third, the question of public false declaration. He laid the first set of documents on the table. They were purchase records, 11 transactions over 4 years, to handwritten order slips from the Sutton household apothecary, organic silver compound in quantities consistent with extended personal use. The handwriting on the order specifications, Arthur noted, matched the hand samples from Frederick's personal correspondence that the Crown's investigative secretary had collected from the Keep's record room that morning. Lord Prescott leaned forward to look at the records. Spencer Clayton did not lean forward, which meant he was already familiar enough with what he was seeing to not need a closer look. 11 transactions, Arthur said. 4 years. Quantities consistent with daily dosing of one individual at maintenance levels. He set the records in a stack. For reference, to the Silver Compound Administration prohibition under the Northern Accords Pack Welfare section defines unauthorized silver dosing of a pack member as willful harm, regardless of dosing level, given the compound's known suppressive effects on wolf development. Frederick said the tonic was administered as a protective measure. What condition? Connor said. He asked it the way a man asks something he knows the answer to already and is asking only so the other person has to say it on the record. Frederick's jaw set. She was unable to shift. The tonic was recommended by the household healer as a stabilizing measure. The household healer, Arthur said. He produced a separate document. Eleanor Upton, pack healer for the Silvermoor Dominion for 11 years. We interviewed her this morning. Her statement, signed and witnessed, indicates that she was never consulted about a tonic for Sienna Sutton. She was never told a tonic was being administered. She has had no professional contact with Sienna Sutton since the girl was 14 years old, at which point she was in normal health. Arthur set the statement on the table beside the purchase records. She was never asked. The compound was ordered directly by Alpha Frederick Sutton. The silence in the great hall settled heavily, not with shock this time, but with recognition. That one had been the silence of shock. This one was the silence of assembly, of facts, arranging themselves into a completed structure that everyone in the room could see. Arthur continued. He produced the financial records, 2 years of failed harvest assessments, the outstanding reparations balance from the eastern border conflict, the Treasury records showing the gap between what the Dominion owed and what it held. The numbers were specific and verifiable and entirely damning. Then the blood pact. He unrolled it on the table with the practiced economy of a man who knows what he is unrolling and respects it as a piece of evidence. Blood Pact Registry, filed with the Rogue Enforcer Company under Captain Oscar Hackney, Arthur said. Signed by Alpha Frederick Sutton in the 3rd year of the current Northern Crown reign. Terms: structured credit against pack resource payments over a 7-year schedule. Secondary clause: collective binding of all Silvermoor pack members as guarantee against default or Crown exposure. In plain language, if this agreement were exposed, every wolf in the Dominion would be legally liable to the Enforcer Company under Blood Pact law. Spencer Clayton made a sound that was not quite speech. Lord Prescott sat back in his chair slowly. The pact is void, Connor said. 3 weeks ago, I purchased the outstanding debt from Oscar Hackney's company at a price of 110% of face value, in coin. He kept his attention on Frederick. Frederick met Sienna's eyes only once. He did not look angry. He looked small. I bought every contract, every obligation, every binding clause. The blood pact is now a Crown debt, which means it falls under Crown jurisdiction, which means it cannot be enforced against the Silvermoor Pack, which means your leverage is gone. Frederick looked up from the table for the first time since the tribunal began. Connor met his gaze. "I came to your keep knowing what I would find," he said. "I came to your keep having already secured the evidence and neutralized the mechanism you were using to protect yourself. I let you have the evening and the night because I needed to understand the full scope of what was done here, and because I needed Sienna to understand it herself before any proceeding began." He did not look away from Frederick. "Everything that happens in this room is a matter of record. The Northern Council will receive a full transcript. Your response to these findings will be part of that record." Frederick said, "I did what I had to do to protect this house." The words fell into the great hall's silence and stayed there. Lord Prescott looked at his hands. Spencer Clayton looked at the table. Madeline looked at the wall above her father's head. Patagon was very still. The response was not anger. It was the specific, heavy quiet of a room full of people who have heard the wrong thing said with the wrong kind of certainty, and who have nothing to offer in return because there is nothing that adequately addresses it. Connor said quietly, "You had a daughter. You chose to break her to protect your debts. Those are not the same thing." The charges were read by Arthur in full. The penalty recommendations: immediate removal of Alpha rank, transfer of the Dominion to Crown stewardship pending lawful appointment, full public trial before the Northern Council on 3 counts under Alpha law. The proceedings adjourned. In her chair against the wall, Sienna watched the guards from the Northern Crown place iron restraints on her father's wrists. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward as they led him from the hall, and she watched him go, and she felt not relief, not satisfaction, not the closure that people in easier stories felt at the moment of justice. She felt the specific, hard-edged thing that comes when a truth you have known for a long time is finally said out loud where other people can hear it, not vindication, which is for people who were doubted. She hadn't been doubted. She had been actively deceived. What she felt was more like the moment you put down a stone you have been carrying in your hands for so long you forgot you were holding it, and your hands ache with the absence of it. She didn't cry. She pressed her hands flat on her knees, the same position she had held on the stone floor of the lower hall for 4 years, and she breathed, and she let the ache be what it was. Chapter 8. The Northern Crown's palace rose from the mountains in white granite and tall windows, set into the highest navigable elevation of the Northern Territory's mountain range, where the tree line grew sparse, and the air carried the smell of pine resin and snow for 10 months of the year. The main keep was 3 stories above the great hall, with towers at the 4 corners and a courtyard where the household drilled each morning in the pale mountain light. Beyond the curtain wall, a 1/4 mile along a stone path that wound through the tree line, the sacred grove stood in a clearing of ancient pine and silver birch, the ceremonial ground of the Northern Pack since before the oldest wolf in the territory had been born. Sienna arrived in late autumn, and she was still there when the first signs of spring appeared at the base of the mountain. The Queen's suite in the eastern tower held a fireplace built wide enough to stand in, a bathing room with a copper tub and a mirror larger than any Sienna had owned, and windows that looked east over the mountain's shoulder toward the lower valleys and, on clear days, the distant suggestion of the northern sea. The bed had 4 posts and a canopy, and sheets that were changed every 3rd day by a young woman named Caitlin Landon, who had come with the Eastern household, and who knocked before entering, and said good morning, as though she expected a response, and did not flinch when the response was slow. For the first 2 weeks, Sienna woke every morning in a state of brief, disoriented panic before remembering where she was. Her body had 12 years of sleeping in a cold room and waking to sounds that meant trouble, and it continued operating on that information for a while after the circumstances changed. She lay in the dark for the 30 seconds it took her body to update its assessment, and then she lay still while the panic subsided. And then she got up. She controlled the lock from the inside. She did this the first morning, testing it, setting the bolt, walking away from it, coming back to confirm the bolt was still thrown. Then doing it again. She was not sure what she was testing for, except the fact of it. Connor gave her time. He appeared at her meals and sat with her when she wanted company, and was absent when she did not in a way that felt managed, but in the way of a person who had paid attention to what she actually needed, rather than to what he thought she should need. He asked permission before entering any room she was in. He did not touch her without indicating his intention first. A brief look, a pause, a raised hand that waited for her nod. He introduced her to the members of his household, one at a time, at her pace, beginning with Arthur, who had the quality of a person who would have been equally comfortable in any century, and who spoke to her with the specific respect of a man who considered her intelligence a given, and had moved on. In the 3rd week, Arthur appeared at the door of the sitting room with a crate of books on wolf biology, lichen history, and the mechanics of silver suppression and its reversal. He set the crate on the table, or told her the library in the East Wing had 3 more cases of related material if she wanted them, and left without elaboration. She read everything he brought within 2 weeks and sent back a list of 5 more titles through Caitlin. She read about what had been done to her, with the steady, absorptive attention of a person conducting inventory, not grieving it while she read, but cataloguing it, because she needed to understand the mechanism before she could have an honest relationship with the healing. Connor began working with her in the 4th week. He did not call it training, because the word had associations for her that he understood were not useful. He called it morning practice, and it happened in the courtyard when the household had finished its own work and the space was quiet and cold and hers. He taught her to breathe with her wolf, not the wolf she expected, but the wolf as it actually was, suppressed and compressed and very much alive, pushing with increasing force as the silver compound cleared her system. He taught her to go still enough internally to hear it. He told her, "Your wolf communicates in sensation, not in words. She tells you things with your body's responses. The temperature shift when something is wrong, the expansion in the chest when something is right, the instinct that precedes thought. You have been having these responses your whole life. You learned to dismiss them because the narrative you were given told you they were false. They were not false." She thought about this for 3 days after he told her. She thought about the times in the lower hall when she had known, before a sound, or that her father was coming. The times she had felt the silver in her food before she tasted it, a metallic heaviness in the air around the tray, and had found a way to eat less of it, and had spent those evenings with the pressure in her chest slightly stronger than usual, her wolf slightly more present, as though the reduction in the compound had let a little more light through. She had dismissed these things as imagination. She had been wrong. She told Connor this one morning in the courtyard, sitting on the stone with her hands on her knees, her eyes closed. He said, "She was always there. She was talking to you the whole time." The silver cleared at different rates from different tissues. Her blood cleared the fastest. Her bone marrow was slower. Like the compound that had accumulated in the connective tissue surrounding her rib cage, the tissue closest to where her wolf sat was the slowest of all, and as it cleared, she experienced what Connor had warned her about: episodes of physical discomfort, pressure headaches during full moon nights, a sensitivity to cold that gradually decreased as the months passed. She was not alone in any of it. At the end of the second month, Connor sat beside her in the courtyard and placed his hand over her sternum, palm flat, and her wolf pushed back hard enough that she gripped his forearm with both hands and held on. "She's nearly ready," he said. "Before we continue, if you've stayed this far into Sienna's story, you're part of something powerful. Comment the word RISE below if you believe she deserves this moment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. Join Jasmine Love Tales. We're building a kingdom of stories that don't look away from the truth. Now, watch what happens when Silver can no longer hold her down. 14 days later, on a clear night when the half-moon was high and the courtyard was cold, and Sienna was sitting cross-legged on the stone with her eyes closed and her hands on her knees, having sat this way for an hour with Connor 4 feet away in the same position, her wolf broke through. The breaking felt like a dam, like the exact moment a dam fails, not the gradual erosion, but the point when the structure cannot hold any more, and the held thing, and the wall, and the pressure, and the years of containment all resolve simultaneously into a single instant of absolute change. Her back arched. The bones of her shoulders moved beneath the skin with a wrongness that was entirely right. The pain was total and immediate, and she made a sound from the center of her chest that was not human and not wolf, and was something that lived in the space between. A sound she had never made, a sound that had been waiting 20 years inside her to be made. Connor held completely still across the courtyard. The shift completed in 17 seconds. Sienna would count them later when she reconstructed the moment. She had counted everything since she was 16, and she was not going to stop now. Where she had been sitting, a wolf stood on the cold cobblestones, silver-furred from nose to tail, heavier and longer than a common wolf, with eyes the color of still water under a full moon. She shook herself once, while testing the body, the way a person tests a newly healed limb, checking its range, confirming it belongs to them. She stood in the courtyard and turned to look at the man who had been waiting across from her. Connor moved to the stone and lowered himself onto his knees. Not in submission, not in deference, in recognition. A king, with his hands flat on the cold stones of his own courtyard, bowing to the wolf he had spent 3 years searching for. Sienna walked toward him on silver paws and touched her nose to his cheek. He exhaled, a long, slow release of something he had been holding much longer than this evening. "There you are," he said, quietly. Chapter 9. The sacred moon grove stood a 1/4 mile beyond the northern palace's outer wall, reached by a path that Connor had kept unlocked his entire reign, because he believed, was in a quiet and consistent way, that the path to sacred things should not require permission from a king. On the night of the full moon, in the 3rd month of Sienna's time at the Northern Crown, the grove was lit by 100 torches in iron brackets along the tree perimeter, and by the full moon itself, which sat in a clear black sky above the mountain, and gave the ancient white granite altar stones at the grove's center a quality of patient readiness, as though they had been there for centuries, specifically waiting for this. The full pack gathered for the ceremony. Connor's household guard stood in formation along the tree line, 230 wolves in the Northern Crown's grey livery, rank marks on their shoulders, bearing correct and shoulders back. The senior council stood nearest the stone circle, 8 men and women who had advised 3 Alpha Kings between them, and who stood now with the expressions of people witnessing a thing they had wanted to see for a long time and had not been certain they would. Arthur Richmond stood to the left of the centre altar stone, with his hands behind his back, and his face showing what it only showed on occasions he considered privately significant. A small, real warmth that he would have denied if asked about it later. Sienna walked the path from the palace gate to the grove alone. She had been dressed by Caitlin and 2 other women of the household in the white of the northern moon rites. Not wedding white, nothing ceremonial in the bridal sense, but the specific white worn for pack bonding ceremonies since the rite was established. A high-collared gown that fell without embellishment to the ground, the fabric heavy and warm for the mountain cold. A silver wolf pendant at her throat. Connor had placed it there himself 10 days before the ceremony, without explanation, setting it in her hand and saying only that it had belonged to the last northern queen and had been waiting. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She walked the path at a measured pace. Her wolf was fully present and fully awake beneath her skin. Not anxious, not pushing, simply there, warm and silver and enormous in the way that a fire that has been burning well for a long time is enormous, established, steady, entirely itself. Connor stood at the center of the stone circle. He had removed his crown before the ceremony. It sat on the altar stone to his right, a gold with the Northern Star device, and he had set it down with the same intention with which someone sets down a tool at the end of a day's work, not discarding it, not renouncing it, simply putting it aside for the purpose of standing in front of someone as a man rather than as a title. He wore the white of the right as she wore hers. He watched her walk toward him, and his expression had none of the political composure that characterized his face in every formal setting she had observed him in. It had instead the expression of a man who has been holding something in trust for a long time and is finally being asked to give it to the person it belongs to. She stepped into the circle and stopped. He said, quietly enough for her alone, "I want to ask you something before we begin." She looked up at him. Not as a king to a queen, or not in ceremony. He held her gaze with the direct, uncalculating attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at her. No performance, no management. "I want to know, from you, in your own words, that you are choosing this. Not from gratitude, not because leaving that keep needed a destination. From want." Sienna was quiet for a moment. The torches along the tree line moved in the mountain wind. The 200 wolves in the grove were entirely still, and the stillness had the specific quality of held breath, not impatience, but the held breath of an audience that understands it is witnessing something that should not be rushed. "For 20 years I was told what I was," she said. Her voice was clear and steady in the cold air. "Defective. They told me I was a liability so often that I stopped arguing and began adjusting my life around their version of me." She did not look away from him. "You did not tell me I was those things. You also did not tell me I was the opposite, because you did not know me yet, and you did not pretend to. You simply looked at me as though what I was, exactly as I was, in a storage room with bruises on my wrists and 4 years of silver in my blood, was already sufficient." He did not speak. He waited. "I choose you," she said. "Not because I need protection. Not because you came for me. Because I know you now. And knowing you, I choose you. Freely." Connor took her hand in both of his. "Then by the law of the moon and the right of the wolf," he said, and his voice carried now out across the grove and the assembled pack and the cold mountain air, "I claim you, Sienna Sutton, as my mate, my equal, and my queen." The bond completed. Sienna felt it the way you feel a dislocated joint properly reset after years of misalignment. A deep, structural certainty, something settling into alignment so fundamental that the rightness of it was almost too large to hold in a single body. His wolf at the edge of hers, not pressing inward, but simply present, the warmth and weight of a completed thing. She felt him as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat, and she understood for the first time what the pressure in her chest had been pushing toward for 4 years. Not escape. This was the moment the father who should have protected her lost his claim, and the Alpha King rose for her instead. She gripped his hands hard. He pulled her forward and kissed her, and the pack howled. The sound rose through the grove in a wave. 230 voices, the full household of the Northern Crown, adding their witness to the ceremony. It rose through the trees and into the open sky above the mountain. And it was not the sound of approval, which is a sound with an audience in it. It was the sound of a pack recognizing its own, a sound that belonged to all of them, and that Sienna, for the first time in her life, felt she was allowed to be part of. In the private rooms of the eastern tower, the fire was high against the mountain cold. Connor sat beside her on the edge of the bed and held her face in both hands and looked at her in the firelight with the attention of a man who has been careful for a very long time and is now, finally, not careful or not reckless, simply present without the management of presence. She was still in the white gown of the ceremony. He was still in his. They sat on the edge of the bed and looked at each other, both aware that what bound them now was stronger than fear and stronger than history. "You are shaking," he said. "I know." Her hands were at his chest, at the fastenings of his ceremonial coat. "It is not fear. I know the difference now." He covered her hands with his and helped her. And then her hands were against his bare chest, the skin warm and alive under her palms, and she felt his wolf at the edge of hers, vast and steady and tender in the way that only very certain things can be tender. He laid her back against the furs with a hand under her head, and he moved over her with the same deliberate care he had shown from the first evening in the storage room below Sutton Keep. Every action preceded by a pause that asked the question, and every pause answered, nothing taken that was not freely given. He was unhurried in the way of a man who has waited 3 years and understands that the waiting was not wasted time, but was the price of this, and that this is worth every day of it. He pressed his lips to the places on her arms where the scars had been, where now there was only smooth, fully healed skin. Connor's lichen healing, given in small, careful doses over the months, working through each mark as he found it, until the physical record of the lower hall was gone. For each one he paused, and the pause was a specific thing. Acknowledgement. I know what was here. I know what it cost. I see where you are now. Sienna wound her arms around him and held on with the grip of a woman who has been holding on alone for 20 years and is no longer required to. The fire burned down slowly. The moon moved across the high window. The palace was quiet outside, and the mountain air was cold, and in the eastern tower everything was warm in the way that things are warm when they are exactly where they belong. 3 months after the bonding ceremony, Sienna stood on the eastern tower's highest balcony in the early morning, when the sun was still clearing the mountain's shoulder, and the courtyard below was just beginning to fill with the household's movement. She held a cup of tea that Caitlin had left on the sitting-room table without being asked, because Caitlin had been paying attention. Now the morning air was sharp and clean, and smelled of pine from the grove and cold stone from the curtain wall, and, faintly from the east, the smell of water that was the northern sea on a clear morning. Her wolf was awake and warm. That was still the thing she noticed most, 3 months in, the constant presence of it, the silver warmth in her chest that was no longer pressure against a barrier, but simply herself, alive and whole. She still caught herself, sometimes, reaching inward with the expectation of absence and finding fullness instead. She did not think she would stop noticing it for a long time. She did not want to. Arthur Richmond appeared at the balcony doorway with the morning's correspondence. "The Northern Council has completed Frederick Sutton's case review," he said. He always reported the important things first. "But his Alpha rank is permanently revoked under the findings of the tribunal. The Silvermore Dominion is transferred to Crown stewardship, pending lawful appointment of a new Alpha." He paused. "Reese Sherman has submitted a formal claim to the seat." She knew the name from her mother's family tree, which she had been reconstructing from the palace's records library with the assistance of a senior historian named Layla Prescott, who had an extraordinary memory for lineage, and who had the patience to answer questions that circled the same ground several times in different directions. Reese Sherman was her mother's younger brother. He had spent most of his life deliberately outside the politics of Sutton Keep, working pack land management in the southern reaches of the Dominion. He had, according to the records, argued with Frederick twice in recorded correspondence, and had been formally removed from the Dominion both times for insubordination. A man who argued with Frederick Sutton and was exiled for it, Arthur had said last week when the name first came up, was probably a reasonable candidate. "Tell the council I recommend his appointment," she said. She looked out over the mountains. "And tell them the storage chambers in the lower hall of Sutton Keep are to be converted. The building will retain cold summer temperatures from the underground spring. It would make a functional archive space for the Dominion's records library." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then, "That is a practical suggestion." She looked at him. He was smiling, which on Arthur was a small and entirely real thing. The door behind her opened. Connor stepped onto the balcony with his own cup of tea and his hair still loose from sleep, the informal disarray of a man in a place where he did not need to be anything other than himself. He stood beside her and looked at the view and said nothing, because the view did not require commentary, and neither did standing beside her. She leaned against his shoulder. The sun cleared the mountain line. In the lower hall of Sutton Keep, which was a cold and lightless room 2 floors beneath a house that had broken her, there would soon be books. There would be records. There would be shelves and catalogues, and the careful work of preservation, the work of making a place that stored things, honest and useful things, rather than hidden ones. Sienna Sutton, who had spent 4 years in that hall, had become Queen of the Northern Crown. She stood in the morning light on the highest tower of a palace in the mountains, her wolf warm in her chest, her king warm at her side, and she breathed the clean air of a place she had chosen, and that had chosen her. The father who failed her had lost everything he had tried to protect. The Alpha King who rose for her had given her a throne, and the girl who had been beaten and broken had learned, in the end, what the wolf inside her had always known, that she was never the broken thing. She was the thing that had survived the breaking. That was not the same country. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of those 4 years, if you felt the moment he knelt, then this is exactly why Jasmine Love Tales exists. Subscribe so you never miss a rise like this one, like the video so more people can find stories like Sienna's. And tell me in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest? Thank you for being here. Until the next story, stay powerful.